Good evening and welcome to another webinar of the Turkey program at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. My name is Ioannis Grigoriadis. I am an associate professor at Bilkent University in Ankara, and I'm also the head of the Turkey program here at ELIAMEP. Today's webinar aims to discuss one of the recent publications produced by our program, a paper by Professor Dimitris Tsarouhas, which is exploring a very interesting topic, a topic that refers to Turkey's defense industry and its potential collaboration with the European initiatives in development of its own defense industry. There's the SAFE initiative, the SAFE regulation that is going to be under discussion. The paper introduces a very important discussion. It is an issue that touches upon many aspects of Greek and European foreign policy. Greece and Cyprus have raised significant concerns about Turkey's participation in the SAFE project, in the SAFE regulation, given the existence of significant bilateral disputes and the existence, of course, of the Cyprus problem. But on the other hand, the development of the European defense industry in light of the major challenges that the European security is facing in Ukraine and beyond is particularly important. So today we're going to have a discussion about this. Feel free to participate by sending your questions through the social media channels that this online streaming is offering. I will do my best to convey them to the author as well as the two discussants. We are very pleased to have together with us Professor Kıvanç Ulusoy and Professor Derya Göçer, who are going to discuss different aspects of the paper. Let me give some information about the author and the speakers before I give them the floor. Professor Dimitris Tsarouhas is also a non-resident senior research fellow at the Turkey program at ELIAMEP, but he's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Security Study Program in Washington, D.C. Professor Kıvanç Ulusoy is teaching at Istanbul University, so Turkey's biggest state university. He has been following developments in the Eastern Mediterranean. He has spent research time in Greece, so he's well knowing developments in the region. Professor Göçer teaches at the Middle East Technical University. She works on issues of political economy, so she will give us a different perspective on where the development of Turkey's defense industry is moving Turkish economy. The development of Turkish defense industry has been one of the most interesting developments in recent years. We can refer to the drones, to the other products of Turkish defense industry that have acquired increasing popularity across the world. So it has appeared to be as a very dynamic sector of Turkish economy. But on the other hand, of course, it raised significant security concerns for Turkey's neighbors, Greece and Cyprus among them. But also, it touches upon Turkey's relations with the European Union. EU-Turkey relations, of course, is a much wider topic and a very complex discussion. But the development of European defense necessitates some discussion about where Turkey should or should not be in this process. So in that respect, I think the paper makes a very significant contribution to the debate. We understand where Turkey's defense industry is and where the European Union stands at the moment, and where and under what circumstances and what conditions can a collaboration occur that could be mutually beneficial for both the Turkish economy and the Turkish business and the Turkish security, but of course for the security of the European Union, the security of EU member states as well. So following this brief introduction, I would first like to give the floor to Professor Ulusoy, who has been exploring Turkish international relations and the role of the defense industry in giving new impetus in Turkish security and political initiatives across the globe. So where does Turkish foreign policy stand in light of the developments in the defense industry and in light, of course, in the possibility that Turkey participates in SAFE? Kıvanç, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yannis. Thank you very much for this invitation, and I'm very happy to be part of this discussion and to see you after a big interval in our regular meetings in the US or in Greece, etc. So. Now I understand Dimitris want to discuss his paper with us, and I'm, I'm very thankful for this discussion, which makes me, which makes me to meditate more on where does Turkey's foreign policy, where is leading to, where it leads to, basically. So the paper includes both Turkey's, let's say, development of defense policy in industrial, as expected from Dimitris. It has both political and economic dimension. Because I think looking at even the most strategic thing without an eye from an economics is misleading. That's why I think this paper contributes to that kind of political economy discussion in a very significant way. However, the Council's regulation on security action for Europe is also an interesting paper. I mean, reading that, even before reading Dimitris' paper, I'm impressed by the regulation, which includes Europe's new plan for industrialization, which is actually linked to Europe's rebuilding as a strategic and geopolitical actor in its neighborhoods, and it links to war in Ukraine. Probably, I understand EU would like to benefit from the war in Ukraine through integrating the defense policies and strategies of its members, which is not an easy task, but at the same time boost the European economy, which is now in a very serious crisis for some time. This regulation also very interestingly puts forward and unexpectedly, I would say, a flexible response strategy that the EU sometimes uses in extraordinary situations like the COVID-19 pandemic or some, crisis response strategy. So, the scholars of EU studies are accustomed to seeing highly bureaucratic regulations, especially when these kind of big procurements are included. The European bureaucracy is extremely sensitive, which makes the EU to this which leads the EU to a kind of paralysis. But I see in the regulations that this is an emergency regulation, which requires a flexible response in terms of financial management and in terms of the industrial policies, particularly an interesting and telling regulation. I mean, I don't want to take much of time, probably, to have more space for discussion. As regarding the case of Turkey's participation in this regulation, few things are quite visible. First of all, I don't want to go into the industrial side of the debate. And it is put very well in the paper that Turkish industry, especially defense industry, is going full steam and there is a governmental will behind this. And Turkey wants to be part of course, this big European program, which includes 150 billion euros. It's a big money, major contribution to Turkey's economy and industrial policy, and especially the defense industry, of course. Turkey's Turkey's position is in this context motivated both by economic motives. Economic interest is at stake, but at the same time, politically, for sometimes Turkey's relations with the EU is not moving very well, and especially in areas like these highly political areas, it is not moving anywhere. I think it's also a great opportunity both for Turkey and the EU to correct its relations and to deepen their relations in such areas like foreign policy and defense industry, where the Europeanization is almost going nowhere, or where there is a lack of integration in any of these areas. Um, there is an important reason for this, probably, as Dimitris rightly mentions. These areas require a deep trust among the partners. So the partners need to trust each other uh, uh, so much so that they can give their technological know-how, knowledge, and strategy to each other. They can share their defense secrets, or defense priorities, security priorities, and this is not an easy thing always. And we see from the reactions of some of the EU member states, I should not say some, because there are mainly two member states, Cyprus and Greece, where they have have specific, let's say, specific concerns regarding Turkey's participation, not just in these kind of highly political matters, but also in other matters as well. We know it from the past. And it is obvious that Turkey, if it wants to participate in these kind of regulations, it should align its security priorities along the side of the EU. But it's not an easy thing, and I think I understand from some recent news that some of the leading EU countries like Germany, like Finland, like France, also pressurizing for Greece and Cyprus to, let's say, to give a kind of flexibility to Turkey's participation in this big loan to boost the defense industry, not in Europe, but also around Europe, and align its relations with Turkey's security priorities. So, uh, I mean, saying all these, few things I should underline. One is related with how Turkey's perception of the West changed over the past let's say, 2 decades since the start of the negotiations in 2005. When you look at the regular reports on Turkey, you see, interesting, the Turkey's foreign policy alignment with foreign policy, alignment with the EU foreign policy is specifically important area where the alignment changes. Especially from 2010 onwards, when the Arab Spring started. The Arab Spring created a break in Turkey's foreign policy towards directing its priorities in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. And in you can easily observe in the Commission reports that Turkey followed kind of a European line in foreign policy on until, until 2010. Then the Arab Spring created one break in this alignment. The second break took place when the aborted coup d'etat took place in Turkey, where Turkey actually seriously questioned not just European involvement, but the European role in the coup d'etat. Then we see that there is a third break when looking at Turkey's foreign policy priorities over the past decade. There is a third break which took place uh, with the kind of formation of a quasi-alliance between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece. And this is also related with the discovery of the hydrocarbon reserves in the Eastern Mediterranean and the changing relations between Turkey and Israel, and inevitably we see Turkey looking at the matters in the Eastern Mediterranean from not anti-European perspective, but a more nationalistic perspective. There is this fourth break, of course, that took place with the purchase of the S-400 missiles, Russian missile system, which Dimitris also underlines in terms of Turkey's foreign policy priorities and defense industry priorities. You see, these four breaks took took Turkey to a level where EU priorities and Turkey's foreign policy priorities started to enter an open conflict. This has probably started to change over the past 1 or 2 years, and we have been seeing it with especially with Donald Trump coming to power in the US, because the American, let's say, push of Turkey to get more involved or correct its relations with the other allies, EU is the case at this point, is an important, I think, fifth break, and it brings Turkey's foreign policy more in line with with the Western priorities. I should not say, I do not want to say actually that Turkey and the EU have been openly in conflict with in any of the regions surrounding let's say Black Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean. But we see that there has not been an alignment in security and defense sector at all. I think this is an opportunity for Turkey and the EU to boost their relations in this respect. But my sense is that this has not been coming from the EU side, but mainly from the inevitability that Turkey has to be part of the European security perspective in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Just let me conclude with this statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kıvanç, for your very interesting comments. I'll now give the floor to Professor Derya Göçer. Could you reflect a bit on how the case of the Turkish growing defense industry reflects on Turkey's industrial development as a whole? Is this an exception to the rule? Does it reflect a greater trend? And how can this reflect on Turkish foreign policy, both in Europe, of course, but we can also discuss on a regional and global basis as well?
Thank you for the floor and for the invitation, and also for the opportunity to read the paper. I rarely find it that easy to agree with papers, but this one I find it very easy to agree. I don't work on EU, I don't work on defense, so that might also be part of the ease. But I think it's because I find so many points of the paper aligned with other industries and other foreign policy moves of Turkey and other industrialization attempts of Turkey, to find our findings similar to Dimitris' findings. One thing that is a bit that sort of struck me, which was a good surprise, is that there was no mention of China. And this is a good surprise, because most of the times when you read on why Turkey is not more collaborating with Western partners of any sort on any thematic area, you find that Turkey's pivot to China and Russia. Here, of course, Russia is discussed, as it should, because it's defense and, Russia-Ukraine war and Turkey-Russia relations. But generally, China is always added to that mix, saying it's Turkey's relations with China that spoils Turkish place in the Western security architecture, and it erodes the general trust. And there was no mention of that, which is the best surprise, because we disagree that Turkey is not as aligned with China as it is feared in the Western circles. Then, of course, the question is, why is it mentioned this much? And perhaps part of that reason is in the paper of the obstacles, the challenges towards Turkey's more integration to the safe framework, but more integration to security procurement frameworks in general, how there are objections within EU. So I think Turkey-China relations is used as a scapegoat for that. On whether, so first I will answer Ioannis' question, and then I will go to my talking points. Is this flourishing defense industry an exception for Turkish industrialization in general? I think it is an exception. The numbers show it as much, but also our qualitative fieldwork show it as much. But I fear if it will remain an exception in the light of the variables that sort of eroded Turkish local industries in the last 10 years, 15 years, whether one good talking point is, could they also erode Turkish defense industry? And one factor, one big variable that does that is not Turkish foreign policy alignments, but Turkish state regime tensions, regime security issues, and rising political informality in Turkish industrialization regulations. Turkish trade environment, industrialization environment, investment environment, and I am being kind by saying rising political informality. There are other ways to say it, but I will stick to that wording for now. So my one point for further discussion as a group is, can Turkish defense industry flourish in the absence of EU coordination with Turkey? Or whether Turkey needs EU as much as EU needs Turkey in this sector to keep on surviving? Because what I learned from studying other industries, such as infrastructure, logistics, how they are constructed, how they are developed technologically, telecommunications, and now we are doing fieldwork on electric vehicles, all in the same zone of how do foreign direct investments help with local industrialization, right? So one thing we see is industries are infrastructures and they need to be maintained and upgraded. You cannot be stagnant. You cannot say, I reached a good place, let me stay here. So especially in 21st century with constant technological upgrading that is coming east, west, north alike, right? So, and that requires a lot of capital intensive moves, and that capital Turkey lacks. So even if not for the lack of technological know-how, but just for the lack of capital that is needed for upgrading, I think Turkish defense industry needs foreign partners. Without that, it will not be able to sustain this. And this is not something specific to defense because I wouldn't know the depth of defense industry, but this is something specific to all industrialization in 21st century. It requires foreign partners and it requires constant upgrading. So I agree with the conclusions that there should be some political conditionality, yes, but also there should be conditionality regarding why this collaboration is taking place, and it should be for the upgrading of the industry, not just sustaining or not just surviving it. I think together, what do we need technologically? Where do we need to invest? Because all industries in this 21st century, large variegated supply chains are actually fragmented, right? So you can invest in this part of it or that part of it. And Turkey cannot have 100% local independent defense industry, as it cannot have telecommunications independently or any other big industrial team. So it will need to collaborate. So it will be good to decide head on the division of labor, so that there's some expertise built up, but in coordination with your partners. So far, that coordination seems to be regarding where the export traction is, like what can I export? So I'm investing in that. But there are problems in that a lot of the exports in defense industry as well, but also in other industries in Turkey, are foreign dependent. And that's where China comes in, actually, not in terms of foreign policy alignment with China, but in terms of dependence on Chinese imports to produce these things. And in some industries, it is 80% dependence on China, even to produce something in Turkey. In others, it is 20%. But in almost all local industries, it is of a critical percentage. And that is a concern Turkey is sharing. And I know that in negotiations, they share it too with their counterparts, with the EU. Because the EU is also grappling and tackling and being challenged by that dependency. And the last we heard of it is last month when China upped its game and decided to have more control over its rare earth mineral exports. And that creates frustration for EU defense industries, for US, for Turkey, all together, right? So I think Turkey's alignment issues, I agree with Dr. Ulusoy that Turkey has shifted a lot across the 20 years. And Turkey has moved now to a place that is even more firmly aligned in the Western, in the older terms of our youth, quote unquote, Western alliance. This is an old fashioned term by now, I guess. Yes, Turkey is firmly in the Western alliance, especially the last couple of months, right? With what's happening in Syria, with all the US visits. It is now vocal. We can actually see it and hear it. And that proves our point that we've been making for the last 6, 7 years, that Turkey's pivot to Asia or Turkey's pivot to Russia was not a real pivot. It was not a grand strategy that is designed from in a coordinated strategy across different state institutions to really leverage Turkish pivot. But it was more of a fragmented strategy geared towards regime security rather than state national interest. This is something that we are conceptualizing further and further. And another political economy term that we use, me and Ceren Ergenç, we use a lot in our analysis of different Turkish sectors, and as they relate to China, Europe, is the growth coalitions. So there is Turkish state, as any other state, is not monolithic. There are different coalitions within it as they reach across the business sector. Here, in this case, there is important business elite, right, in defense industries to be in a coalition with. But so is the case in telecommunications, in infrastructure building, in automotive industry, etc. So there are in Turkey, as of any moment, multiple ideas of how Turkey should grow and which direction it should take, and whether it should be export-led, import-led, a hybrid model, and with what kind of coalitions should that growth model be led, right? And so that is unpacking the regime as it tries to grow. So I think another agenda for further research could be, besides thinking how the Turkish defense industry could be upgraded in alliance with the EU, is what kind of growth coalitions are needed for that upgrading. Because some growth coalitions, as we've seen in telecommunications, for example, lead in 80%, 90% Huawei dominance in that industry. And then that becomes not just a blow to our local and national anthem slogan of, that's the slogan of Turkish industry, no matter which type of industry you get. But, when you unpack that local and national, you get 80% China. That is interesting. But it is also, as it was warned by the United States, as it was warned by NATO experts, it becomes a critical security issue as well. When you have your telecommunications infrastructure so built up by Huawei and ZTE. So that's an issue. What kind of growth coalitions are now today in Turkish defense industry? Now, Dimitris' paper discusses through which growth coalitions it actually emerged. It discusses back 60s, 70s, 90s. And that is an important point that I agree that to have really successful, significantly critically local industrialization, you need long-term strategic coalitions that many actors come in and come out, but the main axis of the coalition remains the same, and the main growth idea remains the same. So I agree with it, and I think it's important when we analyze other sectors of Turkish industry as they relate to foreign investment and foreign collaboration. But what is happening to it now with the rising political informality, the new networks that are being established across Turkish regime and state? Will it remain the same model and understanding and the same targets to grow? And there are papers, I think, discussing this a bit, how independent or dependent is Turkish defense industry. But I don't think they discuss enough the sort of financing that goes with the actors that make it up, and how national they are, how transnational they are, and what would happen if more export controls come from China. So these could be good fertile grounds for Turkey-EU collaboration. And yes, was there anything and another thing that I really agreed with the paper is where it says Turkey is leveraging its NATO membership and its position within the NATO, not just membership, but the fact that it's second largest, the fact that it has the most combat experience, all after United States, of course. I think this is a good materialistic account of understanding Turkish alignment, because this goes beyond discourses. Perhaps discourse-wise, Turkish governments across the last 20 years have not capitalized so much discursively, rhetorically on that NATO membership. Sometimes even they made it sort of fade away in the background at times. And even other NATO members made it fade away to go. But it is real. These are institutional anchors that make a difference to the way industries are standardizing themselves, regulating themselves. If your defense industry has to be aligned as a NATO member state, then you build up yourself differently. So that helps with the resilience of the growth coalition, because we came across this in a railway situation when Turkey was trying to have Chinese financing and construction for a railroad that would cut across Europe. It would go to the European border, but it could not buy the specific Chinese rail tracks because the standards were not meeting EU regulations, and they wouldn't be shown on the EU board, EU train board, whatever the system is. So these kinds of standards, technicalities, regulations may sound trivial perhaps to our ears that were trained in IR and in big geopolitics, but these things actually anchor a country, its industries, its regulations. So it also stops it from going somewhere else. It actually sort of forces it to grow that way. And that has been the case. So perhaps a great deal of Turkish realignment with the West and the way Turkish industrializing has to do with regime security. But another part of that story is, as emphasized in Dimitris' paper, is the path dependency that comes from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and from being member of NATO and from being such an important member of NATO for so long. So being integrated technically, it binds you. So I think we should keep both tracks in mind. So we should keep statehood and the institutional anchors of that statehood in mind as we understand industrialization and where it's going, but also regime security, its political informalities also in mind. Both can be true at the same time, right? Like trying to keep structures and actors all in the same story. Yes, I think that's it for me for now. We can keep.
Thank you very, very much. It was very interesting and give us a wider perspective of where Turkish economy is moving in light of all these developments. Of course, different sectors of the Turkish industry have made substantial contributions to the development of Turkish economy, but there are certain limitations which may be institutional, political, or strategic in that respect. And I think reflecting on the question of strategic autonomy, not only against the West, but also against China, it's an important contribution to the discussion about where Turkey is heading in the near and medium future. I'd like now to give the floor to the author, Dimitris. Would you like to reflect on the very interesting points our colleagues have made and maybe add your own sort of summary of the paper and where you think that its main contribution to a very important debate lies?
Ioannis, thank you very much indeed. And can I also thank our guests and our friends and colleagues, both Kıvanç and Derya, for being with us today and for kindly reading my contribution and discussing it. As you said, Ioannis, I do intend to sort of try and say a few words about what my colleagues just aired. Extremely useful and helpful ways of looking at the issue, not least because Kıvanç obviously comes from an IR foreign policy perspective, and Derya introduces this wonderful sort of political economy account of what this can actually mean. Let me, before addressing those comments, say a few words about my paper and what it aimed to do, and maybe there also discuss a little bit some of the things that Kıvanç touched upon before moving on to Derya's issues that she raised. So I discussed the safe regulation. Let me start from the European perspective here, because as Kıvanç rightly pointed in his remarks, these are extraordinary times for the European project. And the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022 has not only upped the ante for Europe in terms of its foreign policy, and especially in terms of its security and defense policy, it has also accelerated in a way that was unimaginable even a few years ago, the process of European integration in a policy field, again, as Kıvanç rightly pointed, that had been lagging behind other integration areas for a very, very long period of time. So I think it's important to place the safe regulation, the idea of raising 150 billion euros in loans for member states and associated countries in the much wider context of Rearm Europe, which is meant to be an investment that will reach more than 1 trillion euros, and which is linked, obviously, to the Russian threat or the perception of the Russian threat in Europe, but which also makes it necessary for the European Union to rejuvenate old alliances. And I'm thinking especially about the link between Britain and the EU, the way in which the two following Brexit have come closer, make no mistake, is down to Russia. Make sure that we have countries like Norway, again, a non-EU member state, with which Europe is now in consultations and negotiations to hopefully guarantee the 150 billion euros of Russian frozen assets that Europe wants to put in play in order to make sure that Ukraine will get the necessary military and logistical support to continue the war. And this is where Turkey comes in as well. So allow me, Ioannis, to sort of place this in a much bigger context. This isn't simply about EU-Turkey relations. This is really about how Europe perceives of itself and its own security needs. And that's what my contribution tried to sort of suggest, namely that Turkey was and increasingly is a major player in the defense industry. As Derya was pointing in her remarks, reflecting on my contribution, this is not something that began 5 or 10 years ago. This is completely unrelated from the Turkish perspective on the war between Ukraine and Russia, because we all know that Turkey was the only NATO member and remains in some respects the only NATO member with which, direct links of communication with Moscow were not only established, but cultivated and continued for some time, which has created friction within the alliance. But the fundamental point here is Turkey has been able to leverage both its NATO membership, but also the need for Europe to boost its capacity in the immediate future. And another sort of variable that immediately needs to come into play here, and again reflects very much what Derya was saying, and also Kıvanç too, is transatlantic relations. And I say this because Europe wishing to embark on new partnerships beyond the EU framework, invite countries like Britain and Norway and others, potentially Turkey, into new forms of coalitions. There is a lot of talk of coalitions of the willing in Brussels nowadays, with countries that will be able to commit themselves, hopefully, on a ceasefire situation in Ukraine. All of this is a challenge to transatlantic relations, in the sense that here in Washington, we do have, I believe, a gradual de-alignment of at least strategic priorities on the part of the administration with regard to Europe. And I'm not saying that this is a free-for-all and that Europe should take care of itself, but it is about Europe being in a position to shoulder a lot more of its own responsibilities for its own defense. That has been made abundantly clear in the first 10 months of the new Trump administration. And I think this is, again, a factor that we need to consider before we even start talking about China and the bigger geopolitical game to which Derya also reflected. So I think it's important for our viewers, and also for anyone that will be kind enough to read the paper, to read it within that much broader context, which for many in Europe is becoming existentialist, precisely because there is no trust left with regard to Russia, and because the fear of what has been happening in recent weeks with drone attacks and airports being shut down on the eastern flank of Europe may be part of things to come. And that is obviously causing a lot of anxiety. And that makes countries like Turkey extremely significant. Now, let me turn to the other part of my contribution, more about the politics. Those that know my work before on EU-Turkey relations know that I've always believed in the idea that regardless of the actual outcome of the negotiation between the EU and Turkey, making sure that Turkey remains anchored in the Western alliances, including the European Union, is extremely significant. And it's significant for social reasons. It's within Turkey. It's significant for economic reasons. And frankly, from a Greek perspective, it's also significant from a security perspective, because we want to make sure that relations between Greece and Turkey are anchored on the basis of international law, on the basis of international legality, and allow the peace dividend, so to speak, to be shared between the two nations. And so EU-Turkey relations are significant, and we all know they have been derailed. My reading and my analysis suggests that since the type of political conditionality we have had with Turkey frankly did not work, we all know that relations between the EU and Turkey have remained frozen at least since 2018. Again, going back to something that Kıvanç mentioned, I see this more as an opportunity rather than as a challenge. And I think it is down to the countries that want to be part of the new security and defense architecture, including countries like the UK and also including countries like Turkey, to be in a position to showcase their willingness to do so on the basis of fulfilling the criteria that the European Union expects of its member states. And so the concrete suggestion made by Greek Prime Minister a few months ago on Turkey revoking its casus belli from 1995 from the Turkish National Assembly on Greece, I think would be a very practical way forward. Now, I understand the political dynamics in Turkey, just like in Greece, are very complicated. And so it may not be the case that Turkey is ready to move immediately on that step. What I'm saying is there needs to be a new framework, and it needs to be underpinned not simply by Europe's dependence on Turkey's defense industrial complex, which has been improving and by all means should be welcomed within the wider European security architecture, provided it is willing to ensure European security rather than be perceived in Greece and elsewhere as undermining it. So if Turkey is in a position to underscore its willingness to become a productive and a helpful partner in that endeavor, I think this is an opportunity. For as long as this is not possible due to politics, I'm afraid we will not be able to make the kind of progress that I think would be possible within that framework. And so just by way of saying a few more things before leaving the floor to you and possibly having a Q&A, I just want to say one more thing about industry and industrialization and state-directed sort of ways of moving there, because both Kıvanç and Derya rightly pointed to that. We are going through a new era. And as I said before, I think for Europe, for most of Europe, Ukraine has been, and the war in Ukraine has been a wake-up call. But we have had a much more long-term transformation in the way in which growth and the way in which the state's role in facilitating growth has been perceived for some time. The Chinese economic example has concentrated minds. The possibility of a major new geopolitical rivalry has suggested, not least because of the crucial significance of rare earth minerals and other critical materials, that ways towards ensuring strategic autonomy or the capacity to compete goes through a new role for the state in facilitating industrial production and productivity. And that has become obvious in the United States. Please recall the CHIPS Act. Please recall the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States. And also, again, going back to what Kıvanç mentioned, I think this is happening in Europe as well. Please don't forget the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which was one new way of experimenting with a different way of doing integration. Think of the debate that is now undergoing on the multi-annual financial framework and a new way in which we can bind new policies together by member states. And crucially, in the context of reviving Europe's defense and industrial capacity, think of the usage of export credits and tariffs and taxes and state aid rules in Europe are changing, right? Away from the more liberally inspired paradigm in order to assist the industrialization of those policy sectors which are crucial for future prosperity. So again, from a macro perspective, I think all of this EU-Turkey debate and the safe regulation and Turkey's defense industrial complex needs to be placed in a rapidly evolving international political and economic environment where new actors have appeared and old actors are trying to adjust to the challenge, painful and difficult as this may be.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. That is very interesting. And I think you put this discussion into a wider and very, very important framework because it is going to be important for the future of European security. I have a couple of questions I would like to share with you. Maybe I can ask the first question to Dimitris because it's just a quick follow-up to what you said. We have a question on Turkey's position in SAFE, not just in light of Greek and Cypriot concerns about their sovereignty and the threats and the casus belli, but in light of Turkey's position to sit on the fence between the West and Russia in Ukraine. So in that respect, there have been a lot of concerns about Turkey's credibility as a loyal ally in NATO. Is this discussion reflected in all this, or is it just hidden again between Greece and Turkey and Cyprus, sort of raising their own national security issues against Turkey that practically hides a wider discussion about whether Turkey is a credible partner for the West in light of recent developments?
It's a very good question, Ioannis. Let me be very frank about this. There is a perception in Greece, which I don't think it is mistaken, that Turkey has indeed tried not only to mediate between Russia and Ukraine, it did so from the very beginning of the conflict, but also, maybe putting it a bit crudely, benefit from it in ways more than one in terms of its capacity to sort of be the bridge between both sides. In a way, if you think about it, the same is true in terms of what's happening on the energy sector right now between the partnership between Greece and the United States and Turkey's continued energy deals with Russia and of course, its dependence from it. Now, having said that, let me also be very clear. The perception in the EU is, and I think Kıvanç alluded to this at the beginning of his remarks, is that this is more of a Greek and Cypriot concern, much more than it is a wider concern. I think this is mistaken on the part of Europe. Let me be very clear. I think that relations between Turkey and the European Union need to be placed on a solid institutional footing, and the sort of transactional one-time deals that we engaged in the past, such as the migration deal, did not do anything really substantial in terms of furthering European integration or Turkey's European Union accession path. So that is my perspective. But I think it's important for our listeners to know that, as I mentioned in my intervention, Turkey is broadly seen in Brussels today and even beyond Brussels as much more a solution to a problem, right, in terms of the day after in Ukraine on the ground, than a problem in itself. And this is something that maybe my paper is trying to contribute to. It's trying to point to the complexity of the issue, because the perception that Turkey is necessarily a solution is one that I don't necessarily share. And that's why this debate needs to continue. An aspect of the sort of troubles that we have had in the Eastern Mediterranean, right, need to be illuminated much more than has been the case until now.
Thank you very much. Kıvanç, there is a question that reflects upon your presentation as far as Turkey's quest for strategic autonomy is concerned. This has been a very popular theme in Turkish foreign policy discussions. Very often it has been reflected in domestic political debates as well. A few years ago, we ran a series of surveys in Greece and Turkey about views of each other, the views of Greek and Turkish public opinion of each other. And one of the most striking findings we had in Turkish public opinion was that this proposition that Turkey should pursue its own strategic autonomy received positive views of more than 83% of Turkish voters, which is definitely showing that is a popular position across the political board. But where does this discussion lead us in light of this development on EU-Turkey relations, and in light, of course, of the role of the defense industry as a sort of locomotive of Turkish economic and security development? You are muted, Kıvanç.
Thank you very much, Yannis. Before answering to your question, I should underline again that a regulation, this safe regulation, tells a lot of things actually. I mean, it's a we should read in detail, and we should try to see the changing approach or mentality behind this regulation. It tells us a lot about, from economic perspective, the easing of budget rules, flexible procurement structures, etc. These are, for the ones like us who knows how the EU works, these are incredibly challenging points. Really, in economic terms, they try to aim so many things at the same time. But also the reactions to this regulation tells us other things probably that probably the creators of this regulation has not thought about. And this is what brings us to your question related with Turkey-EU relations and Turkey's defense industry and Turkey's strategic autonomy, etc., etc. So I wanted to, whether I was successful or not, I wanted to open or put the regulation and the debates regarding the regulation and Turkey's reaction, etc., to a context in my first intervention. I hope I was able to do it. But let me underline a few things. First of all, imagine Turkey might not want to be part of this regulation. So it's surprising for me that Turkey wanted to be part of this new European defense industry project, because until recently I was seriously thinking that Turkey completely delinked its security perspective, and together with that, its perspective of industrialization, let alone defense industrialization, from the European perspective. Now I'm surprised to see Turkey wanted to be part of it. This is an important decision, and it gives a big signal for Turkey to return back to its, let's say, Western priorities. Really, I mean, I was thinking that Turkey started to seriously search for alternatives to the West. Turkey's intention to participate in BRICS, Turkey's relations with Russia, Turkey's relations with China gives me these kind of clues. But now I'm thinking that Turkey's turn to Europe with this within this framework is an important sign that we still have a little chance for Turkey to come back and to be part of the Western security and defense projects. So it will be pity to disappoint Turkey at this stage. This is the conclusion that I came across, and I understand very well Greek concern regarding this Turkey's participation in these projects. Turkey, as Dimitri underlined, and Greek Prime Minister asked Turkey to change its policy regarding the Aegean Sea. This might be, let's say, this might be acceptable from a Greek point of view, because Greece is a full member of the EU, and it has the right to ask an accession country like Turkey, who wants to be also part of the European framework. I mean, it's understandable, and probably I try to understand this again from a positive point of view, and that Greece wants to engage in dialogue with Turkey on this topic, which is not easy to ignore. It's also, I mean, I understand also a Cypriot point of view in terms of sovereignty, territorial integrity that, again, rightly pointed out in Dimitris' paper, that Turkey's relations with the EU has been stuck for about, let's say, 20 years because of the Cyprus question. And the Cyprus question turned to be a more difficult question recently after the discovery of hydrocarbon reserves in the Eastern Mediterranean, but more importantly after the changes in Turkey's relations with Israel. And we see from mid 2010 onwards that Turkey, I mean, there is kind of building up a kind of, I do not want to say anti-Turkish, but an alliance which is not expected easily welcomed as well between Greece, Israel, and Cyprus. Sometimes I mean, Egypt also could be included. I don't think that this alliance is just between the state. It is an alliance between the EU and Israel that shows me also that explains me also EU's reactions or passive positioning towards Israel's invasion of Gaza. However, all these gave me again or brought me to a conclusion that it is not easy for Turkey to again establish ties genuinely based on trust ties with the EU. I have been sensing recently that Turkey has been feeling again surrounded by enemies from Israel in the Eastern Mediterranean and Israel and Cyprus in the Eastern Mediterranean to Greece in the West. So there is kind of this obsession of being surrounded by enemies has been again tabled more and more in Turkish media and Turkish by the leading voices in Turkish politics. So this quest for being part of EU safe regulation comes to me as a surprise. I was expecting that Turkey simply thinking that there is no way that Turkey could be part of the EU frameworks like this. And what explains this to me is basically two signs. The change in Turkish foreign policy is, I think, a result of the latest NATO summit, which shows that the Americans are not interested in or are not very keen on defending Europe. Secondly, that the crisis in Ukraine has reached to a point where where the EU needs to recover its alliance with Turkey and with other countries in the Balkans and the Black Sea as well. So we are living, I think, in a very interesting time of geopolitical change, where EU takes finally some very serious decisions. And the EU safe regulation is an interesting example of that. This is an EU style. When I read the document, I see as if I'm reading EU regulation in a regional policy or in social policy. So this is an EU style of saying very significant things. This is this is this is a very telling, I would say, regulation in many ways. I hope I was able to answer to your question.
Thank you very, very much.
Yes.
Now I have a question for Derya. In light of your presentation, one can make the conclusion that the argument that Turkey needs the EU less than the EU needs Turkey doesn't hold. In a way, Turkey's industrial development still is requiring this close engagement with the Western and European standards and sort of businesses and industrial infrastructure so that it can remain competitive, both in the region and beyond. Is this only relevant to defense, or can we say that the same is the story for telecommunication, the other industries where you're working? So I would like to share your view on that, please.
Is this only for defense? It depends on the growth coalition in that particular sector. For example, for telecommunications, we just had the 5G tender, and Turkey is moving to 5G and new infrastructures will be built, so a lot of purchases will be made. And probably that will only increase the dominance of Huawei. So it seems that Turkey has given up on localization of its telecommunication, when in fact, as our paper will be out next year, early next year, we've shown that Turkey had actually, in collaboration with defense sector, Turkey had a flourishing telecommunication sector, because a lot of telecommunication infrastructure is so coordinated, or is like a side product of defense industries, defense communications through ULAK, which was a state coordinated institution. Turkey had actually a local industry, and it's been suffocated by Huawei products across the last 10, 15 years, and that was allowed by the state. So that's hence my warning regarding Turkish defense industries. Just because something is local and flourishing does not mean it will go on forever. We've seen in telecommunications it can actually stop. In, for example, renewable energy, Turkey is really trying hard to diversify its portfolio of foreign dependence to be able to have a local transition to renewable energy. Turkey is collaborating with China, but also with a lot of EU member states. But it does depend, as it often does, on the conditionalities of that foreign investment in terms of upgrading a local technology or building a local technology. There is one sentence in Dimitris' paper that I underlined. It has to do with the leverage was evident in Turkey being able to insist on technology transfer and joint production in major procurement programs. So if Turkey has that leverage in a foreign bilateral relationship for its industrial upgrading, whether that it can actually attract that technology know-how, which it has a tradition with the EU member states and their companies. It does have a tradition, for example, learning from Nokia, learning from Siemens, and it cannot recreate those traditions with Chinese counterparts. It tried, but it failed. So Turkish business actors, private, as well as Turkish bureaucracy, has a tradition of using leverages with EU level actors, EU member states. See, for example, the Italian collaboration of defense, even that's a good example of being more of a there is still an asymmetry, of course, because it's EU capital intensive, but the asymmetry is less. Whereas when you collaborate with China or with Russia, even on gas, perhaps, the asymmetry is higher and it is more to the disadvantage of Turkey. I think that issue of asymmetry and that it is more to the advantage of Turkey when it collaborates with European actors, even with American actors, is true across all sectors.
Thank you very, very much. That was very interesting. I would like now to give the final word to the author of the very interesting paper. And I would also like to share a question that has just arrived from one of our audience that is having a more realist understanding of the situation we're trying to describe here. So I'm reading his question. Is that we live in a historical phase where geopolitical threats are met with containment, while interdependence is outdated. So in a nutshell, why should Greece help the growth of Turkish defense sector? Dimitris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ioannis. To put it mildly, yes, that's a realist perspective. I'm not sure it's actually a realist in an IR sense of the term, but you can call it this way. I'm not sure I understand what the question means, because there is no suggestion here that Greece is assisting Turkey. The whole point of the analysis I made in the policy paper is that Turkey's defense industrial complex has started to sow the seeds of its growth many decades ago within a more statist economic paradigm. And it has been able to flourish over the last 2 decades in particular as a result of a massive R&D investment uptick on the part of the Turkish state in very close cooperation with the private sector. I don't understand where Greece fits into this. Probably our listener or viewer is referring to Greek-Turkish relations, which is the second aspect of my paper. And there I'm not suggesting that Greece assists Turkey in a free-for-all kind of relationship where there is no need for any backstop, so to speak. My paper is very clear that Turkey's participation in SAFE needs to be conditional on fulfilling requirements that Greece and Cyprus, for that matter, would be happy with. And anything less than that would not be to the satisfaction of Greek policymakers in a way which is abundantly clear. In terms of interdependence and cooperation, again, the paper points to the fact that Turkey's defense industrial complex has grown to an extent that it has allowed it to deepen previous cooperations with Western states as well as firms. And I think that's a qualitative leap forward that, again, my paper tries to underline. Turkey has not become a net exporter of its drones and other UAVs only in Eastern markets of marginal value where the stakes are relatively low from a Western perspective. The deals that Turkey has been able to conclude with a whole number of NATO member states and EU member states point to the significance of that development. And therefore, since Derya also referred to tech transfer and know-how, let us be very clear. It seems to me that the Turkish defense industrial complex is sitting on very solid ground. The notion of autonomy and enhanced state capacity to promote the kind of cooperations that would allow it to flourish is one that the Turkish state, so to speak, had endorsed and has been sharing way before this became a thing in the United States and the EU. And again, that's a reality we need to come to terms with. So I suppose what I'm trying to get to in trying to both conclude my intervention and also answering the question is that this is not about Greece assisting Turkey, because I don't think that's the intention of anyone. Even if it was the intention, it wouldn't be to my knowledge. I think the fundamental point here is to find ways in which you can maximize your national security from a perspective that leaves you better off to face upcoming challenges. And that is, I suppose, the way in which things are being thought about in Brussels. I think this is the way things are being thought correctly in Athens. And my hope is this is going to be thought through, hopefully, in Ankara as well.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. And I think this is bringing us to the end of our webinar. I would like to apologize to the viewers whose questions we couldn't address because of lack of time. Please let me thank our two guest speakers, Professor Derya Göçer and Professor Kıvanç Ulusoy, who contributed to a very interesting, in my opinion at least, discussion on a paper that Dimitris Tsarouhas has recently authored in the Turkey program of the ELIAMEP. I would like to thank Dimitris for his paper and his contribution. And I would like to thank you all for being with us this evening. And I hope we'll see you again soon in one of the following webinars of the Turkey program at ELIAMEP. Thank you very much.